I want to bring in Bill Kirk, CEO and co-founder of Weather Trends 360. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is a timely time to have this conversation about the impact of weather when it comes to both economic impact and financial markets impact, especially when you think about the wildfires that are happening in California. When I look at the latest data out there, the Pacific Palisades fire is just 13% contained, which is an improvement of what we saw over the weekend, but still, again, a long way to go. Altadena, North Pasadena, that is 27% contained, so it's a very difficult situation. And although the wildfires are, well, we'll find out more. It's we'll call it a natural situation right now, but it's impacted by weather, and it has far-reaching consequences. We've seen entire towns devastated, businesses devastated, lives lost. When we think about the economic impact of the wildfires and also winds that are expected to come, what is your view on what's to be expected?
Well, again, wildfires are certainly going to have an impact for certain groups like insurance companies. But again, it's just the everyday weather. Just we call it the power of 1 degree, how 1 degree of change impacts retail sales stock performance. Again, go back and look at the spring of Q1, right? Q1 was the wettest in like 40 years on the East Coast. Home Depot, everybody expected Home Depot to be down about 2. They came in with very poor earnings because of the really wet. They blamed the weather, right? And they were down 3%, right? And then in Q3, everyone expected them to be down 3, have another bad quarter in Q3, Home Depot, and they didn't factor in that they had 4 landfalling hurricanes. They had the warm, dry fall, which is great for Home Depot sales, and expected down 3, and they were down like less than 2. Right, so their stock goes up 20%. So if you don't understand how that weather influences equities, really any business, you're going to be surprised by the weather all the time.
How can companies prepare better for weather, for climate change? I mean, it's not something that's necessarily easily predicted.
Yeah, again, well, that's what we do. So we project year ahead weather. I know that sounds crazy, by week, by mile, everywhere on Earth. So we predict 3 sensible things: temp, rain, snow by week, using a statistical, it's trillions upon trillions upon trillions of statistical calculations, 24 climate cycles, like a La Nina that we're kind of in right now, that in part is helping to create this fire. If you look at the fires in California, this was predictable. We said last year would be the worst fire season in 4 years. It was. We said this year would be the worst in 10. And we said that a year ago. So it's not rocket science. If you look at the really wet weather they had the previous 2 winters in Southern California, all that vegetation got very green and lush, dies out in the spring and fall, but it's very thick. That's fuel for this fire. So again, 2 very wet years contributed to this epic, historic fire season, and it's just starting. Sadly, this is going to be at least the worst in 10 years. So, those are small blips in a Home Depot sales. Certainly, they'll get a benefit from rebuilding and construction materials, and it'll hurt others. It can hurt maybe a department store, right? You're not as worried about this. Nice to haves versus the must haves, right? So again, that's what we do. If you can get those weather trends right, you can project these sales, equities a year out.
What are the takeaways that other retailers or other businesses can glean from, a miss on predictions, like you just talked about Home Depot, or even other businesses that were clearly caught flat-footed with regard to preparation around wildfires? What can they do to prepare better in the future?
I think the first thing is you got to understand how weather influences your business, right? I mean, we know with Home Depot, they benefit really from warm, dry winter year-round, right? You can build stuff outside in a warm, dry winter, versus right now we're having the coldest January in 31 years, snowiest in 11 years nationally. This is a very, very cold, detrimental January, and unfortunately we see this negative weather trend all the way through probably early summer. So we have the wettest spring, coldest spring in 6 years. So if Home Depot and folks thought, and a lot of the retailers suffered in Q1. It wasn't just Home Depot. If you think last year was bad, this year's much, much worse. So it's a very, very cold spring, very frigid May, right? That's just you're not going to go out and buy the spring seasonal items you buy because you don't need to, right? It's frigid outside, right? So if you don't understand how that's going to influence your business, you're going to be surprised. Again, we're putting on the record here, but we'll see how poorly performance will be here in Q1, Q2. And again, January, think about the economic impact on the consumer. It's the coldest January in 31 years. Your heating bill goes up 5% for every degree colder year over year. There's a huge impact on that consumer discretionary spending happening now. They haven't got their January bill yet, but when they do in February and March, right? That'll be another, income reducing, ability to spend going into a very cold spring.
So the projection is a cold spring for 2025. If that's the case, where do you expect to see outperformance and where do you expect to see underperformance?
That's tough. Nobody really does well in a cold, wet, snowy spring. I said snowy part too. So typically what you want to see is really warm, dry weather from about January, right after Christmas, warm, dry weather until about back to school, July, August. Then we need something in August, really cold, wet, stormy weather to get people out of the vacation mindset, thinking back to school. So you want a cold, wet fall, which we did not have this year. So we do believe cold, wet fall will happen next year, actually 2025. So that's about when the good news would happen. So again, we see kind of a out of sync weather cycle through, summer for most retailers. The ones that can win in a cold, wet year are more of the online retailers, the Amazons, the Walmart.coms. You'll still shop if it's a cold, rainy, think about it, spring weekend or Memorial Day weekend. You'll be online. You may shop it that way, but you're not going to rush out to the, department stores because you don't need anything really.
How do you quantify how much businesses should or need to incorporate weather planning into their business planning?
Yeah, so what we do is, we have, about 100 Fortune 1000 clients, so the big retailers, seasonal suppliers, financial services, about 30 big banks. They want to understand the weather from how is it going to influence a Home Depot or a Macy's or whomever, right? So again, our goal is to quantify their sales. So we've looked at point of sale data for 10,000 seasonal items, everything you would see in a Target or Walmart. We've analyzed those categories against past weather to then project those sales a year out. So again, you don't have to be exactly right on the weather, right? I mean, we're really good. Our year ahead forecast is, more accurate than a week 2 Google forecast, right? So it's, even though it's year ahead, it's a statistical model, not a physics model. Traditional meteorology is physics, constantly changing, right? Even NOAA came out, this was going to be a warm winter. We're having the coldest January in 31 years, right? So if you plan off of the not so accurate, governmental models, right, you're going to be surprised when you have this really cold, snowy January. That was a benefit to, heaters, auto batteries fail like crazy in weather like this. So if you don't understand that lift, you're going to miss opportunities that we've had here.
And then we just showed some of your Power of 1 Degree technology. What does that do with regard to preparation, and how can, say, a place like California, which is one of the biggest economies, not just in the nation, in the world, prepare better as a result of something like this?
Yeah, unfortunately, everyone, even you can listen to the press on the fires, right? I mean, we've had 2 very wet years in California, and there were budget cuts to the fire department because they didn't have fires. Two years ago, we had the least fire season in 30 years. There was no fires in California. Then last year it started to ramp up a bit, the most in 4, but nobody planned for that, right? So if you had really wet years, it wasn't rocket science to see that we were going to have a ton of underbrush that all grew 5, 6, 10 feet higher than it was 2 years ago because of all the rain, dries out, and now you've got this tinderbox. And sadly, again, this is just the start. Again, it's very unusual to have a fire this big. We had one last year in Texas, the second biggest in history, but this is just getting started, unfortunately. California really needs to ramp up. It's the driest in 10 years. This is just the start of, one community, but it could be, dozens more as we go through the season. So again, what do you do now? What do you do with fire lines, fire breaks, right? Get things around communities, do now.
I know it's heartbreaking to see some of the images come out of there, and I've heard experts talk about the data that you talked about, how they had a wet period, and then that created the growth that we saw that has now created this tinderbox there. So they really need rain, honestly. There, it seems like the airdrops are wonderful to see, and drops of the fire retardant as well. But California really needs rain.
It's a drought cycle. We have the driest in at least 4 years, so it's not good. There's not a lot of hope here for rain.
Wow. So let me ask you about, when you think about the weather, I know you have some data that shows the correlation between some weather patterns and recessionary signals. Can you tell us a little bit more about that data and correlations?
Yeah, so again, as we said earlier, warm, dry weather, we've proved this for everybody, right? Think about your own buying behavior. If you have a really warm, dry January, February, March, you're thinking spring. You're outside, you're building stuff, you're able to do things. The economy lifts in warm, dry weather. Just a short traffic, everything wins. So when I say we're going to have the coldest, wettest, potentially snowiest spring all the way into May and June in 7 years, that's a huge negative drain on the overall. You're not going to go out and rush and buy the things you don't need, especially in this economy with inflation, right? If people buy on need, so I'm not going to rush out and do that this year, right? So we had a very, very warm, spring last year and a record hot June, and sales went up 3, 4, 500% for just everything under the sun in June last year. So you have a much colder spring this year. This is a huge downward trend. So that's why we call it kind of recessionary, right? You're going to see negative same-store sales or weaker than expected, right? So when all those, nobody knows it yet, but when Q1 earnings come out and they're a little bit weak, and then Q2 earnings come out and they're very weak, right? That's when the economy starts to yikes. What's going on? The consumer's pulling back. Is it the inflation? Is it, right? Nobody really always factors in the weather.
All right, great insight. Bill Kirk, CEO and co-founder of Weather Trends 360, on the impact of weather, both economically and to different businesses and financial markets impact. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bill. And to that point, we've certainly seen some pressure across some of the property and casualty stocks with regard to what we're seeing over in California. You saw Travelers lose ground last week, AIG lose ground, Progressive, Hartford Financial Services, the list goes on.